This is lecture 14, Reform and Society in Antebellum America, 1790 to 1860. Reform means change, especially in terms of social issues. Antebellum means before the American Revolution. We're going to examine significant social changes in America, or at least movements to promote social change in America like we had never seen before. Now, throughout American history, when it comes to society, it's always been greatly influenced by religion. We talked about when they were colonies before the American Revolution, there was a great awakening that where old ideas were challenged by new ideas. It was an element of democracy because it created more churches. Well, during this period, we're going to go through a second great awakening. And like before, inspired by some of the same events. Challenges within Christian faith themselves, new ideas, religious ideas within Christian faith itself. While the Trinity used to be a big part of Christian religions, a new idea would be Unitarianism. God existing in one person and not the Trinity. So when there's challenges of traditional Christian churches, it leads to a competition and religious revivals throughout the American states. What we call camp meetings, these huge rallies of important evangelical leaders trying to push their faiths on people, and some of them would be new faith. Peter Cartwright is one of those leaders. He's the best known of the circuit riders, meaning he took it upon himself to have the most of these type of camp meetings. He was a Methodist that traveled through various states promoting religion. The other important Second Great Awakening religious leader was Charles Grandison Finney. And you'll probably see more documents of Charles Grandison Finney because his influence was especially important, because Charles Grandison Finney promoted in his preaching that Christians needed to do more than just turn to God. Christians needed to change society. Christians needed to reform society, fix the problems with society, make significant changes. He's given credit to push Christians to call for reforms. We'll talk about those reforms in the next slide. We'll talk a little bit more about the heart of the Second Great Awakening. The heart of the Second Great Awakening, or where it began, was in the state of New York, in northern New York, if you look at the map to the right. This is where we saw the big the new Christian churches or reform movements taking place. They called this part of New York the Burnt Over District. And the reason why it got that name is because these religious rallies, of course, like other religious proceedings, there was a big emphasis: turn to God, live by his word, or burn in hell. So this is why this area got the nickname the Burnt Over District, the heart of the Second Great Awakening. If you look in the map, these are some, particularly the new Christian churches that came out of the Second Great Awakening. There were the Mormons, led by Joseph Smith. They came out of the Burnt Over District. Following Joseph Smith, they would have a religious leader, the Mormons, that would lead them all the way to Utah, a Zion, a haven for them to practice their faith without persecution, because they were targeted by some Christian churches. Brigham Young would lead them out to Utah, Salt Lake City. Of course, we know Brigham Young University, based on the Mormon leader that took them out west. There were the Adventists, as you know, the Seventh-day Adventists. They would also be called the Millerites, another Protestant faith that came out of the burnt over district. Now, the Christians of the Second Great Awakening, a lot of them were women, but the big emphasis again was reform. Recognize the evils in society and take steps to try to fix it. The Second Great Awakening inspired the spread of abolitionism, the movement to end slavery. These Christians realized that abolitionism was an evil. Early on, even before the Second Great Awakening, we recognized that we would start to see abolitionism, especially in the northern states. An example was the American Colonization Society in 1817. This was an early abolitionist society. But their idea of abolitionism was unique to the ones that will come later in the century. The American Colonization Society actually believed not only in freeing slaves, but sending them back to Africa. They had a particular territory over there that would accept them, Liberia. So this was early in the abolitionist movement, the American Colonization Society. They wanted to free slaves and send them back to Africa. But by the mid-1800s, abolitionism in the North was looking to end slavery and even give the African American rights. A leader in that cause by the mid-1800s was William Lloyd Garrison. Here's a picture of him over here to the right. He was considered a radical abolitionist just for the very fact that he wanted to immediately end slavery and grant those slaves equality. William Lloyd Garrison, one of the most popular abolitionists, he even published a newspaper dedicated to the cause of abolitionism. We see the picture of the newspaper up here. The name of his newspaper, William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, was called The Liberator. That wasn't his name, it was the name of his newspaper, dedicated to the cause of abolitionism. By the mid-1800s, the larger abolitionist organization, the more popular one with both whites and African Americans in it, was called the American Anti-Slavery Society, for which Garrison was a member of. Another important abolitionist that got a lot of attention, the event surrounding Elijah Lovejoy. Elijah Lovejoy was a newspaper editor in Illinois. A newspaper editor that used his newspaper to promote abolitionism. Well, a pro-slavery mob attacked his newspaper and actually killed him. Elijah Lovejoy became a martyr for the cause of abolitionism. A martyr is someone who dies for a cause. And there are various abolitionists. I'm just highlighting some of the ones that come out the most in AP exams, etc. Another would be Frederick Douglass, the very famous Frederick Douglass. There's a picture of him in the right. His picture you'll see in most U.S. history books. Because what made Frederick Douglass unique was he was an African American and a former slave himself, who spoke of his life as a slave. It painted the picture, and he was very articulate. He wrote an autobiography of his life as a slave. That gained a lot of attention in the North. The narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass. This would take a while. They would not be a majority. It would only be in the North. But through the 1800s, leading up to the Civil War, and during the Civil War, the abolitionist movement would grow. And you would see political illustrations like this. Am I not a man and a brother? Again, promoting the end of slavery. And while not all, some calling upon the equality of those slaves. So this was one of those reforms that came out of the Second Great Awakening. Christians wanted to end slavery, the movement of abolitionism. So that's an important area of reform you can discuss. Another would be temperance. I told you a lot of women were involved in the Second Great Awakening, and women were especially concerned with the issue of alcohol. But both men and women were involved, but women especially thought that alcohol was ruining society. This would be called the temperance movement. Okay, this is an area of reform. The temperance movement was designed to limit or prohibit alcohol in America. This is what Christians took on during the Second Great Awakening as well. An organization dedicated to the cause was the American Temperance Society, created in 1826. This illustration is very popular in the area of temperance. It shows a man taking a drink for the very first time, and how gradually it's the start of something way more diabolical. It leads to ruining his life. Right here's a man taking his life. And look who it hurts. It hurts the family. These are the steps. They argued that this is what alcohol was doing to society. A leader in the temperance movement, Neil S. Dow, he was called the father of prohibition. Anytime you see the word prohibition, usually associated with ending alcohol. And the reason why Neil S. Dow is called the father of prohibition is because he helped to pass in the state of Maine the first law in America to prohibit alcohol in 1851. Now, into the 1900s, we're actually going to have an amendment for a while in our history that's going to prohibit alcohol. Well, this is the foundation of that movement to end alcohol, the temperance movement. Again, another area of reform, another area of change that came out of Christians during the Second Great Awakening. A third area of reform. I told you women were active in the Second Great Awakening. And let's remember where the status of women. The status of women was one where they would serve the family and the husband. They had no political strength because they couldn't vote or serve. They did not have the same property rights as men. So there's going to be a movement in the mid-1800s by women to get more rights. The women's rights movement, the beginning of the women's rights movement, was in this area and led by Christian women. These are the major leaders of the women's rights movement in the 1800s. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott. A younger, kind of a student of the following two that would take us into the 1900s would be Susan B. Anthony. You might have heard of that name before. It seems like in modern day America we hear more about her. She even has a coin with her likeness on it. But it was Stanton and Mott that organized the first national convention dedicated towards women's rights. That national convention was called the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. The first national convention to promote women's rights. And again, open to men and women, but of course it would be dominated by women with this new progressive idea. At this convention, they were demanding suffrage. That's that word again, suffrage, A-G-E, suffrage, which means the right to vote. This is what they promoted at the convention. The right for women to vote. It was time for them to vote. They were demanding for property ownership, the rights of property ownership. They were demanding for the full custody rights of children. Because in those days, if there was a separation of family, etc., the man decided what happened to the children or who the children went with. They really had no custodial rights. The man did. So these were some of the issues promoted by women at the Seneca Falls Convention. They also put together a very popular document called the Declaration of Sentiments. And here's the most famous quote of the Declaration of Sentiments. The Declaration of Sentiments is where the women literally rewrote the beginning of the Declaration of Independence. And you see it down here. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men, and here's what they added with the Declaration of Sentiments, that all men and women are created equal. So this was a foundation for the modern women's rights movement. It came out again out of the Second Great Awakening and Christian women. They recognized this is a problem with society, that women don't have these rights. And they promoted it during this era before the American Civil War. It's going to be quite a lengthy battle. Women would not get the right to vote until 1920. But this was the beginning. Another area of reform, another area to bring about change, that came again out of Christians, the Second Great Awakening and so forth, education. And the biggest change that the reformers wanted was to provide more public schools. They felt that they owed that to all American children, not just wealthy. Tax-supported public schools. You know, in order to have a truly great nation, a democratic nation, the idea was to provide educational opportunities to everybody. One of the education reformers, here's a few of the education reformers. One, Horace Mann. Here's this quote to the right. Education, then, beyond all other devices of human origin, is the great equalizer of the conditions of men, the balance wheel of the social machinery. Horace Mann also created a school to train teachers. Noah Webster is considered an education reformer, and you know him, that's right, because of the dictionary. He helped to standardize American English, which is a little different than English that you find in Europe. Standardized American English. William H. McGuffey comes under the category of education reform. He published a very popular book to help children to read. I remember this came out in an AP exam once. The title was called McGuffey's Eclectic Readers. Well, and a lot of my students did not know what that was. Well, McGuffey helped to publish a book designed to help children to read. Another example of education reform, some wealthier Americans, etc., sponsored these lyceums. Because not a majority of Americans cannot afford or had the means to go to universities. So lyceums were traveling lectures. Okay, traveling lectures to promote things like science and English literature, you know, available to the public to get educated. Again, an area of reform during this period, education. Some other areas, not in too many details, of reform. Dorothea Dix, we see her picture right here. She promoted reform in the area of the mentally handicapped in America. Because in the early 1800s, there was so much we did not know about people that were handicapped mentally. And because of her work, she promoted state institutions to help families deal with members that had mental issues. Another area of reform was prison reform. And again, you can especially see this coming from Christians, Second Great Awakening. Up until this point, prisons were all about punishment, which they've always been. But there was a push in the mid-1800s to also use prisons to reform, to rehabilitate those were charged with crimes. So in order to rehabilitate, the movement of prison reform included education. They allowed people in prisons to acquire an education. They also made church services available to them. So education and church services is how reform was brought to prisons. Now, this cluster of terms right here is similar but somewhat different. There were Americans that recognized there were a lot of problems in societies, like the ones that we talked about, but they did not have the patience, I guess, to change society. There was a movement of Americans to go out and create their own societies, their own perfect societies. That's what a utopian society was. Again, inspired by Christians, especially from the burnt over district, because a lot of these societies would be Christian and in the area of New York. Okay, communes, utopian society. Americans that just wanted to escape society and try to create their own little perfect communities. And here's some examples. It was Brook Farm in Massachusetts. A lot of American well-known authors, writers, intellectuals from that time congregated to Brook Farm, working the land together, devoting time to spiritual matters. Another utopian society, Oneida, founded in New York, 1848. They believed in the second coming of Christ. They believed in some radical ideas, especially at that time. Corporate marriage of all members to each other. Communal care of children. It's like we're all married to each other and we take care of everyone's children. Sexual equality. Very, very progressive. Oneida Colony. There was also the Shakers that came out of the state of New York. Also believe in the second return of Christ. Believed in sexual equality. However, they were against marriage. They were known for adopting many orphans and converting them to their communal society. And you see they were different, they were communal, they were very, very progressive. But some of these seeds that they planted were seeds of democracy, especially the equality of sexes. Now, this era of reform, when we talk about society before the Civil War, what's going on? The Industrial Revolution is taking place. And we have a second Great Awakening. Kind of put those two together. What impact is it having on American society? Well, the family is changing. The American family slowly becomes a little bit smaller because it's very difficult to manage the larger families. It's going to be a little bit more child-centered. People are discussing better ways to raise their children because of public schools, the emotional needs of children, and so forth. There's going to be less arranged marriages when we talk about this American family. Women. I can't say enough about the role of women. A lot is taking place during this period in the 1800s because of women. They went from Republican motherhood at the end of the American Revolution. Remember, raise your children to be good citizens of the Republic. And we're seeing at least some women do some things well beyond that. We're seeing women involved in women's rights. We're seeing women involved greatly because of industrialization in jobs and economic opportunities in the cities. involved in social reform, abolitionism, trying to improve society, more opportunities of teachers and nurses and these types of things. Now, we're going to see a slow movement in those areas, but society overall still looks at females in a traditional role. And that's what the cult of domesticity is. The fact that while these things are starting to slowly happen, the majority of America still believes in this picture over here to the right, which really reflects the cult of domesticity, that a woman's main responsibility is to their family. So now let's look at our themes of the era of reform, an era of change. Analyze the extent to which the Second Great Awakening transformed American religion in the years prior to the Civil War. Okay, there was a Second Great Awakening. Like the first one, it was liberal versus old ideas, and we had new churches break out with new ideas. Number two, identify major reform movements of the Second Great Awakening. This was all dedicated to those reform movements, but be able to talk about the origins of them, be able to give examples of them. Abolitionism, temperance, women's rights, education reform, prison reform, okay? Number three, analyze the changing views of women in America from the Revolutionary era to the Civil War, and what factors were responsible for changing women's roles.